President Donald Trump and District Attorney Fani Willis began their second terms in office just a few weeks apart.
I, Fani Willis, do swear and affirm.
In Atlanta, the district attorney hosted an inaugural gala. The dress code, black, pink, and gold.
Just over a year ago, Willis was a rising star on the national stage, and Trump was fighting 13 felony counts in Georgia for trying to overturn the 2020 election.
Now, Trump is president again, immune from prosecution for the next 4 years, and Willis has been rebuked by the courts and is fighting to keep the case alive.
See, we're living in a time where a convicted felon and a criminally charged defendant can brag about harassing and targeting law-abiding citizens.
On today's show, a look at the reversal of fortunes for Trump and Willis.
Plus, we dig into a renewed push to better compensate the wrongfully convicted.
You can't give up. It's kind of like the old saying, you got to keep up the good fight. And what they've done with this new bill, I think it's encouraging.
And we'll take stock of the legislative session so far ahead of the critical crossover day deadline next week. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE. Sam, I'm really eager to begin with your reporting on Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis and the downfall of the Georgia election interference case. You've covered the DA for a few years now through all of the twists and turns of the case. Why did you want to do this story?
Well, Rahul, I thought it was kind of striking to think about Willis and Trump's trajectories in tandem. As we mentioned at the beginning of the show, they have both just started their second terms. Willis was kind of holding Trump's future in her hands as she prosecuted him on those 13 felony counts. And her own political future would inevitably be linked to how this case unfolded. Well, fast forward, and the fortunes of these two figures have kind of flipped. Trump is now back in power. His chances of ever facing trial for these charges is minuscule, and it's Willis, the prosecutor, who is now on the defensive. I mean, what a reversal here, with huge stakes for Fulton County and also for the country.
Okay, Sam, so you went to this inaugural ball for the story. Just tell me, what was it like?
Rahul, this was one of the glitzier events I've been to. The gala was the night before Valentine's Day, and the theme was for the love of justice. It was held in one of the ballrooms at the Marriott Marquis Hotel downtown. There was an open bar, a few hundred people, a live band, and also Georgia's last Democratic governor, Roy Barnes.
Let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Is that not what we have in Fani Willis?
So, Sam, Fani Willis has been in front of the cameras and microphones a lot less lately. What did she have to say at the gala?
Well, for one, she did not express any regrets.
In my first 4 years in office, I learned a really hard lesson. Folks are here for you during the good times, but the slightest bit of wind, and folks quickly begin to fall to the wayside.
So let's unpack the context here. Last January, a Trump co-defendant lodged a serious allegation that the DA was involved in a romantic relationship with Nathan Wade, the special prosecutor she hired for the case. Wade ultimately resigned as a condition for Willis continuing on the case. But in December, the Georgia Court of Appeals ruled that Willis should still be removed. Trump praised the decision on stage at the gala, and with Wade seated at her table, Willis excoriated it.
See, there are judges in my very state, in my very courthouse, that are more interested in their next appointment than upholding the rule of law and following their oath.
Rahul, what I thought was interesting is that Willis could have devoted this speech to accomplishments of her first term or goals for her second, things like addressing violent crime or her prized youth mentorship program. But instead, she spent a lot of these remarks focused on Trump. Now, she didn't name Trump, but as you heard in her comments at the beginning of the show, mentioning the convicted felon in the White House, references like that were obviously not lost on anyone. Willis closed by asking the audience what they were willing to sacrifice in pursuit of justice.
Okay, Sam, so let's turn to the legal questions here. And what's next for the case?
To answer that question, I talked to Georgia State University law professor Anthony Michael Kreis.
There's a lot of room for redemption here, but this case is much more on life support than it's ever been before.
Now, to be fair, Kreis says Trump had almost no chance of going to trial last year, no matter what Willis did, once the U.S. Supreme Court established broad presidential immunity. But what happens now at the Georgia Supreme Court could really be the final nail in this case, depending on what they decide to do about Willis. Trump's 14 remaining co-defendants could still see trial in the next few years, but if Willis is disqualified for good by the Georgia Supreme Court, Kreis says it's unlikely anyone will be appointed to take over.
If Fani Willis is removed and none of the co-defendants are ever brought to trial, I think this will be a real mark of shame.
Of course, many Republicans have praised the prosecution's unraveling as a triumph of justice. Trump's Fulton County mugshot is now hanging in a frame outside the Oval Office, and Georgia GOP senators are continuing their own investigation of Willis. Here's Fulton County Republican State Senator John Albers.
It's been a political circus for way too long. But the people who are still being stuck in the middle of this, they can't move on with their lives and their very basic freedoms right now.
And Sam, this week, the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Michael Boggs, stepped down. Republican Governor Brian Kemp will appoint a new judge to the bench. The Supreme Court could eventually rule on Georgia's abortion law and, as you mentioned, Fani Willis's future on the Georgia election interference case.
Right, but it is unclear how much this development will actually affect what happens next.
So, Sam, Willis got reelected overwhelmingly in November, but it was before she was removed from the case and Trump got back into office. You covered her reelection campaign, but I'm curious, how are Fulton County voters feeling about everything at this moment?
I was really struggling to figure out how to gauge the political ramifications for Willis. Like, had anything really changed since her win in November now that Trump was back in the White House and she may have lost this case for good? So I did what I often do when I don't know where to turn. I talked to voters. At the Carter Center Farmers Market, I met Wendy Cooper, who told me she feels empathy for the DA.
As a black woman living in America, this is to be expected. That powerful, smart, African-American women are really the target of a lot of hatred.
Cooper told me that even if Willis had pulled off a conviction, it probably wouldn't have mattered because Trump had already been found guilty on charges in New York.
But did that have an impact on the election? No.
I also stopped Lorraine and Andy Ramey on their way to brunch. They told me that they strongly disagree with the court removing Willis. They felt her romantic relationship was bad judgment, but had nothing to do with the integrity of her case. But they also feel like she bungled the best shot to hold Trump responsible for his actions after 2020, which included pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State to find votes.
That made it very personal. I was hopeful, and then it slowly faded. She knew better.
Andy Ramey says he's fed up with the justice system, fed up with how Willis handled such an important case, and fed up with the country that sent Trump back to the White House.
The justice system has embarrassed itself from Fulton County all the way to the Supreme Court.
Now, last fall, Lorraine begrudgingly voted to keep Willis in office. She voted for every Democrat on the ballot. But when Andy stepped into the voting booth, he made a decision he did not take lightly. In the race for district attorney, he left his ballot blank.
Sam, thank you so much for all of this reporting. We'll be right back. This is Plugged In from WABE.
Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE. Let's go back to the state capitol where the critical crossover day deadline is upon us next week. But before we get to that, I want to dive into some reporting at the Capitol you've been following for a long time now, Rahul, and that's the push from the wrongfully convicted for a better system of compensation.
That's right, Sam.
Okay, so talk to me first about how this system currently works.
So, Sam, the current system involves individual pieces of legislation for each person who's been wrongfully convicted and then exonerated. Sam, let me take you to one of the largest hearing rooms here at the state capitol, where on Wednesday, 5 of these resolutions were considered, including for Lee Clark. We introduced you to him last year as he was seeking compensation for the 25 years he served for a crime he didn't commit. After the hearing, I asked him how he was feeling about going through this process again after it failed last session.
Going through it again, it's just, I don't know, it just weighs heavy on you, especially when I look at the way the outcome turned out last year. And I don't know, it just weighs real heavy on my mind. I haven't been able to get it off my mind. I've been thinking a lot about everything to do with this, and I don't know, it's just my hope and prayers that everything goes through smooth.
So Clark's resolution would compensate him about $1.9 million. That comes out to about $76,000 for each year that he was in prison. Now, Clark's resolution, along with the 4 others, are moving through the process in the House.
Okay, so you mentioned that Lee Clark is trying again. That implies that these resolutions have been tied up in the past.
That's right, Sam. Actually, the last time one of these resolutions made it through the whole process to compensate someone was 2022. In recent years, these resolutions have been caught up in the Republican-controlled Senate for various reasons that have not always been clear.
Okay, so I think this gets to the point that we're talking about here, which is there is a push to change how this process is done. What policy change is exactly being considered, and why has that been such a tough sell as well in recent sessions?
So, Sam, Democratic State Representative Scott Holcomb has been trying to change this system also since the 2022 session. Let me take you over to the state capitol rotunda, where Holcomb was joined by other lawmakers, Clark, and 2 other exonerees to talk about the new legislation to overhaul this whole compensation process.
So what we are proposing to do, and there is strong bipartisan support in the House, is to have a process where these claims will be heard by administrative law judges. We already have them in our state. They can review the evidence, apply the law, and what the standard requires, and this is important, it requires that they actually prove innocence. That's built into the law. It would allow a claimant who is successful to receive $75,000 per year. We've studied the processes across the country, and based on those, we've decided that that is a reasonable figure. Is it a fair figure? No. But is it a reasonable figure? Yes. And it's something that we're hoping will move forward this year.
Joining Holcomb as lead sponsor of House Bill 533 is Republican State Representative Katie Dempsey, who's been working with Clark on his compensation effort.
As legislators, we are not, I think, qualified to be judge or jury of these individuals and hold their lives and their future in our hands.
Now, House Bill 533 does still give lawmakers a partial say on these resolutions as part of the budget process.
So you're saying that both the individual compensation resolutions and then also this broader effort to overhaul the whole system have failed in recent years. And to me, the reasons aren't entirely clear. I'm wondering if you can give us any insight into what's going on here.
So, Sam, what I'm generally hearing is that there are some lawmakers who want a bigger say in this process or want more things taken in consideration, like a person's criminal history or specifics about the case. We heard lawmakers at a hearing Thursday asking some of those questions. And then there are some lawmakers who believe it should be local governments, not the state, that is on the hook for this compensation. I should note that there is a competing overhaul proposal, Senate Bill 176, which also changes the process, but most notably compensates at $50,000 a year for each year in prison and would not allow compensation if a person's been convicted of an unrelated crime.
So to have the best shot at getting to the governor's desk this year, this legislation needs to clear the House by next Thursday night, March 6th. That is crossover day, this key deadline for bills to advance out of at least one chamber of the legislature.
Sam, that's true. Typically, lawmakers work late into the night, sometimes after midnight. But remember, there's still a shot for bills to become law, even if it doesn't make this deadline. The text can be inserted into another bill in the same code section. We've got all sorts of colorful names for it. Zombie bills, Frankenstein bills, ghost bills, vehicles, whatever you want to call them.
Right, but for now, let's start by talking about legislation that won't be needing the zombie bill treatment. These are bills that have already cleared at least one chamber ahead of crossover day. So lawmakers moved swiftly to ban transgender girls from playing on girls' sports teams. This week, the Senate passed legislation to curb state regulations, which Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones says complements efforts by President Trump and Elon Musk to slash the government's footprint. That bill, SB 28, would require state agencies to review all rules every 4 years and give the legislature more power to block new ones. And most notably, the Georgia Senate has also advanced Kemp's top legislative priority, overhauling civil litigation rules, an effort you'll often hear referred to as tort reform. Ultimately, key Republican skeptics, all trial lawyers, came around to support the bill last week after winning a small concession in the section on medical damages. And Kemp World also made it clear that opponents could face primary challenges. Here's one of those potential holdouts, Republican Senator Brian Strickland.
The Senate has a job to do. And despite all the noise, despite all the threats, we're going to do our job.
Let me mention another one of Speaker Burns' priorities, codifying legal access to IVF. So, Sam, this is partially in response to an Alabama Supreme Court ruling last year that defined frozen embryos as children, temporarily leading to providers shutting down services there. The bill adds this sentence to Georgia law, quote, individuals have the right to obtain in vitro fertilization, unquote. Look, you've been hearing a lot of personal stories around IVF, which includes the bill's lead sponsor, Republican State Representative Lehman Franklin. He and his wife were struggling to have a child. They're now expecting their first through the help of IVF. Franklin talked about his bill on the House floor Thursday.
If you have concerns about the issues surrounding this, or you have ideas about it, or you don't know where you stand, you don't have to worry about this, because this bill doesn't go near it. It doesn't go anywhere to touch it. All it does is codify it and put it in the law. So you can all rest easy and vote yes on this bill and feel good about it.
And what he's referring to there are issues like abortion and the debate over when life begins. The bill passed 172-0, which is notable that all Republicans were on board, even though some religious conservative activists raised concerns about the bill, but they did not actively campaign against it.
And of course, we should note that just because a bill passed one chamber does not mean it will be smooth sailing on the other side.
That's right, Sam. House leadership was anticipating some headwinds and have already made moves to ease the passage of the civil litigation overhaul in the House by circumventing the House Judiciary Committee. And of course, there's always a chance the IVF bills could fizzle over in the Senate.
Okay, so we've been talking about legislation that has already cleared one chamber ahead of crossover day. Now let's talk about some of the bills that have not surmounted this important threshold yet, but we know our priorities of at least one chamber, so they're likely to get a move on in the coming days. House Speaker John Burns has said one of his top priorities is moving a huge bill focused on school safety following the deadly school shooting last fall at Appalachia High School. That bill has a lot of complexities that need to be ironed out, like a provision facilitating information sharing between state agencies like education and juvenile justice. Well, this bill has yet to get out of the Education Committee, so that doesn't leave a lot of time for it to clear the House next week.
Okay, Sam, so let's talk about the bills that the future may not be as bright. There's not much movement or not much time for action by next Thursday. You know, Sam, one of the questions I get every year is what's going on with gambling? And let's start there. I keep hearing that there's a very narrow bill in the works that would put legalization of online sports betting on the ballot as a constitutional amendment referendum. The money would go to the Hope Scholarship and pre-K programs, but that proposal has not been filed as of this moment. There is Senate Resolution 131, which would allow casino gambling and other forms of gambling, but the challenge there is getting a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate to get it on the ballot.
All right, so I'm going to select the bill that you could probably pick for this category every session, Democrats' perennial push to fully expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. There was some excitement from Democrats at the beginning of this session when they rolled out a bill with 4 Republican co-sponsors. But Kemp has, of course, made his opposition to full expansion very clear, and the Democrats' bill has not gotten even a committee hearing yet.
So before we wrap up, I do want to talk about an important piece of legislation that doesn't exactly fall into the rules of crossover day, but is treated with urgency, and that's the amended fiscal year 2025 budget. That's a proposal that makes changes to the current budget funding state government through June 30th. Starting with Governor Kemp, there's been a lot of focus on storm recovery efforts, including in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Governor Kemp, in his proposal, added $615 million for those efforts. Then, House budget riders shifted another $197 million. Finally, Senate budget riders shifted another $125 million. Much of the money is focused on aid to local governments, ag farmers, and timber farmers. But something I noticed, there's $25 million for homeowners who may still be struggling. I talked to Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman Blake Tillery on how that's going to work.
The Senate's proposal places these monies at the Department of Community Affairs for partnerships with nonprofits where they can apply for grant funding. They tell us how many homes they're going to fix, and we get to make a decision if that's a wise investment of state dollars. Again, all we're trying to do is get the mostly elderly, I'm sure, that haven't had a chance to get these trees even out of their yards now almost 6 months later, help them get their roofs and put something besides a blue tarp between them and the elements that outside.
The Senate passed the amended 2025 budget on Wednesday. House and Senate budget writers are now working out their minor differences, so this could get to the governor's desk in the next few days. Once that's done, full attention, at least budget-wise, will be on fiscal year 2026. All right, Sam, that's a lot we've covered. Let's leave it there.
But before we go, I want to note that you can follow all the bills we're following with WABE's Bill Tracker, now available at wabe.org/2025 Bill Tracker.
That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE. If you love the Gold Dome Scramble podcast, you can find all of that rich analysis and context on Plugged In.
And you can now get Plugged In your podcast feed and on the radio every Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. on 90.1. But if you listen by podcast, head on over to the Plugged In podcast feed, hit subscribe, and leave us a rating.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Enjoy the sunny weekend.